The loneliest people are not the ones who have nobody around them. They are the ones everybody stopped noticing a long time ago. And on a freezing Thursday night outside Flagstaff, Arizona, Ethan Walker realized he had become one of them without ever seeing it happen. The wind pushed dry dust across the cracked parking lot behind the old Sinclair gas station, while headlights from passing trucks flashed across his face for only a second at a time before disappearing into the darkness along Interstate 40, leaving him standing alone beside a faded blue pickup that coughed smoke every time he tried to start it. Ethan pulled his jacket tighter around his shoulders and stared at the steering wheel like he could somehow force the truck to survive one more night through pure stubbornness. But the engine answered him with another weak, grinding sound before falling silent again. 20 years earlier, he had owned a small construction company outside Denver, a nice two-story house with a white fence, season tickets to Rockies games, and a family that used to wait for him at the dinner table every night at 6 o'clock sharp. But life does not usually destroy a man all at once. It happens slowly, quietly, in ways nobody else notices until one day the mirror reflects somebody who looks like a stranger wearing your face. Ethan still remembered the last real conversation he had with his son Tyler before the divorce papers came. Tyler had been 16, standing in the garage holding a baseball glove under one arm while pretending not to cry. Ethan had promised him things would get better soon. He had believed it when he said it. Back then he still thought hard work could fix almost anything. But work disappeared after the recession. Debts piled higher every month. Pride kept him from asking for help. And little by little the people who once depended on him learned how to live without him instead. The cold air burned inside his lungs as he stepped out of the truck again and looked across the empty highway where neon motel signs flickered against the black sky like dying stars. He checked his wallet one more time, even though he already knew exactly what was inside. $34, an expired insurance card, and an old photograph folded so many times the edges had turned soft as cloth. In the picture, Tyler was 10 years old, smiling beside a lake in Colorado with a fishing rod almost taller than he was. Ethan rubbed his thumb across the image carefully before sliding it back into his pocket. Somewhere far down the highway, a dog barked once. The sound carried thin and lonely through the desert wind, and Ethan barely paid attention at first because abandoned places were full of sounds people learned to ignore. Then he heard it again, closer this time. He turned slowly toward the edge of the parking lot, where the weak yellow light from the gas station barely reached the darkness beyond the dumpsters. At first, all he could see were two pale eyes reflecting the light, calm and steady, watching him without fear. A large German shepherd stepped forward from the shadows, its thick coat moving in the wind while snow-colored breath drifted from its mouth into the freezing night air. The dog looked tired, maybe hungry, but there was something strange in the way it stared directly at Ethan, almost like it recognized something broken inside him because it carried the same look itself. Ethan let out a slow breath and shook his head with a tired smile he had not made in weeks. "Guess we both got nowhere left to go tonight," he muttered softly, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, the silence around him no longer felt completely empty. Most people think trust is built through words, but sometimes trust begins when two exhausted souls decide not to walk away from each other in the dark. Ethan stood still beside the truck while the German shepherd watched him carefully from across the parking lot, neither moving for several long seconds except for the wind pulling at their coats. The dog looked older than he first thought, with gray beginning to spread around its muzzle and a scar running through one ear like it had survived more than one hard winter out on the road. Ethan slowly crouched near the open driver's side door and reached into the paper bag sitting on the passenger seat. All he had left from earlier that day was half of a turkey sandwich wrapped in a napkin from a diner outside Winslow. He hesitated for a moment before tearing off a piece and setting it gently on the cracked pavement between them. "Do not say I never shared anything with you," he muttered quietly. The dog did not rush forward the way a starving stray usually would. Instead, it studied him first, cautious but calm, before finally stepping closer with slow, measured movements that somehow reminded Ethan of soldiers returning home from wars they never fully escaped. The shepherd lowered its head, sniffed the food, then looked back up at Ethan one more time before eating it carefully. Ethan laughed under his breath, a dry, tired sound that surprised even him because he could not remember the last time something felt almost normal. Another truck thundered past the highway exit nearby, its headlights washing over the station before fading into the desert again, and for a second Ethan imagined what his old life must look like from the outside now. Just another man stranded in the middle of nowhere with an empty gas tank and a dog nobody wanted. The station clerk eventually stepped outside carrying a mop bucket, glanced toward Ethan, then toward the dog, and frowned immediately. "You better not feed that thing around here," the man called out. Animal control already picked up 2 strays this month. Ethan looked at the shepherd standing beside him now, close enough that he could see frost gathering lightly along the dark fur near its shoulders. The dog did not growl or bark. It simply stayed there quietly, as if waiting for Ethan to decide something important. "He is not bothering anybody," Ethan answered calmly. The clerk shrugged with the kind of indifference only lonely jobs create and walked back inside without another word. Ethan leaned against the truck again and stared out at the endless highway stretching west through the darkness. Somewhere beyond those miles were cities full of people rushing home to warm kitchens, families arguing over television remotes, children asleep under blankets, ordinary lives continuing without any idea that a man they would never meet was standing out in the cold wondering how. Everything disappeared so quietly. The shepherd suddenly stepped closer and sat beside him near the curb. Ethan looked down in surprise as the dog rested its body against his leg just slightly, enough to share warmth without demanding attention. Something inside Ethan tightened unexpectedly at that small gesture. He swallowed hard and looked away toward the distant motel signs because men his age were not supposed to feel emotional over a stray dog in a parking lot. Yet the truth was simple. Nobody had chosen to stay beside him in a very long time. After several silent minutes, Ethan finally opened the passenger door of the truck and patted the worn seat. "You can stay until morning," he said softly. The German shepherd climbed inside without hesitation, curled up carefully against the old blanket near the window, and closed its eyes like it had been waiting all night to hear those exact words. There are nights when a man falls asleep believing tomorrow cannot possibly feel worse, only to wake up and discover life still has new ways to test how much loneliness a person can carry. Ethan barely slept inside the truck because the cold kept slipping through the cracked door seals no matter how tightly he wrapped the blanket around himself. But sometime near dawn, he opened his eyes and realized the German shepherd was still there, curled quietly against the passenger seat, with one ear raised toward the sound of distant traffic. For a moment, Ethan simply stared at the dog while pale blue morning light slowly spread across the empty parking lot outside. The desert looked different at sunrise, less cruel somehow, though the freezing air still covered the ground in a thin layer of frost that shimmered beneath the gas station lights. Ethan rubbed his tired face and checked his phone out of habit, even though he already knew there would be nothing waiting for him. No missed calls, no messages. The battery sat at 9%, just enough to remind him how disconnected his life had become. He slid the phone back into his pocket and glanced toward the shepherd again. "You sticking around, huh?" he asked softly. The dog lifted its head slightly at the sound of his voice, watching him with calm brown eyes that carried a strange kind of patience. Ethan stepped outside the truck and stretched his stiff back while the cold air bit through his jacket immediately. Across the road, the small diner attached to the station had just opened, and the smell of bacon drifting through the air made his stomach ache with hunger. He counted his money again before walking toward the entrance, already calculating how far $34 needed to stretch if the truck never started again. The bell above the diner door jingled softly as he stepped inside. Most of the booths were empty except for 2 truck drivers drinking coffee near the window and an older waitress wiping menus behind the counter. She looked up as Ethan entered, then noticed the German shepherd standing quietly outside the glass door. "That your dog?" she asked. Ethan hesitated for half a second before answering. "Looks like he might be now." The waitress smiled faintly, the kind of tired smile older people give when they recognize sadness in somebody without needing explanations. "Dogs are usually smarter than people when it comes to choosing who matters," she said before pouring coffee into a chipped white mug. Ethan ordered the cheapest breakfast on the menu and glanced outside every few seconds while waiting. The shepherd never moved from the sidewalk. It simply sat there watching the door like it understood Ethan was not coming back without it. Something about that loyalty unsettled him because he had spent years convincing himself he no longer needed anybody close enough to leave again. When the food arrived, Ethan quietly slipped half the bacon into a napkin before walking back outside. The shepherd stood immediately the moment he opened the door. I know. Ethan muttered while kneeling beside the dog and offering the food. Probably not veterinarian approved. The dog ate carefully from his hand before nudging Ethan's arm once with its nose. That small gesture hit harder than Ethan expected. He looked down at the shepherd for a long moment, then finally noticed a faded leather collar hidden beneath the thick fur around its neck. The metal tag attached to it was scratched, almost smooth from age, but after rubbing dirt away with his thumb, he managed to make out a single engraved word beneath the frost and dust. Scout, Ethan whispered quietly. The German shepherd looked up the instant the name left his mouth, tail moving once against the frozen pavement as though somewhere deep inside. After miles of wandering, and who knew how many empty nights, the dog still remembered who it used to be. Some memories do not return all at once. They arrive quietly through tiny details that break open parts of the heart you thought were buried for good. Ethan sat on the hood of his truck while the morning sun slowly climbed over the Arizona desert, warming the frozen air just enough to melt the thin frost gathered along the windshield. Scout rested nearby beside the front tire, calm and alert, occasionally glancing toward passing cars as though still expecting somebody familiar to appear from the highway. Ethan could not stop thinking about the way the dog reacted to hearing his own name. It was not random. There had once been a home somewhere, a family, somebody who probably missed this animal more than words could explain. Ethan reached down carefully and scratched behind Scout's ear, earning a slow wag of the tail in return. Looks like you belonged to somebody decent once, he murmured. The sentence stayed in his head after he said it because he realized he could no longer remember the last time anybody might have described him the same way. Around mid-morning, Ethan managed to get the truck running after nearly draining the battery trying. The engine rattled hard enough to sound like metal shaking loose underneath the hood, but it stayed alive. That alone felt like a small miracle. He climbed behind the wheel while Scout jumped into the passenger seat without hesitation, settling in like the spot had belonged to him for years. Ethan smiled faintly despite himself before pulling slowly onto the highway. Interstate 40 stretched endlessly ahead through pale desert land broken by old billboards, abandoned motels, and distant mountains fading blue beneath the cold winter sky. The truck heater barely worked, filling the cab with weak, lukewarm air that smelled faintly of dust and engine oil, but it was still warmer than sleeping outside. Ethan drove in silence for nearly an hour before speaking again. You know, Scout, there was a time I used to hate driving alone. The dog lifted one ear at the sound of his voice while keeping its eyes on the road ahead. My son used to sit right there where you are. Every summer we would drive up into the Rockies with fishing gear packed in the back and enough snacks to survive the apocalypse. Ethan laughed quietly at the memory, though the sound carried sadness underneath it. Tyler always talked too much. Could never sit still longer than 5 minutes. He tightened his grip slightly on the steering wheel. Funny thing is, I would give just about anything to hear him interrupt me again now. The highway signs rolled past one after another, while memories Ethan spent years avoiding slowly resurfaced inside the silence. Tyler at 12 years old learning to throw a football in the backyard. Tyler falling asleep during road trips with headphones crooked around his neck. Tyler standing in the driveway the day Ethan moved out after the divorce, trying hard to look angry instead of hurt. Ethan swallowed hard and kept his eyes fixed ahead. I stopped calling after a while, he admitted softly. Not because I did not care. I just got tired of hearing disappointment in people's voices. Scout shifted slightly in the seat beside him before resting his head against Ethan's arm for only a second. The gesture startled him enough to make his chest tighten unexpectedly again. Ethan shook his head slowly. You got bad timing for being comforting, buddy. Around noon, the truck sputtered dangerously near a small town outside Holbrook, forcing Ethan to pull into another aging gas station surrounded by faded ice machines and rusted soda signs. He stepped outside muttering under his breath while lifting the hood. Steam curled lightly from the radiator. Of course, he sighed. Scout climbed out beside him immediately, staying close enough that Ethan could feel the dog following every movement. While Ethan searched the truck bed for an old gallon jug, A little girl exiting the convenience store suddenly pointed toward Scout excitedly. "Daddy, look at the police dog." Her father smiled apologetically toward Ethan. "Beautiful shepherd," he said. Ethan glanced at Scout standing tall beside the truck, sunlight catching the dark brown fur along his back. For the first time in years, somebody looked at Ethan and saw something beside failure standing next to him. Hope does not usually arrive in dramatic moments with music playing in the background. Sometimes it appears quietly in the form of small, ordinary things that remind a person they still belong somewhere in the world. Ethan spent nearly 40 minutes trying to cool the truck engine while Scout stayed beside him the entire time, pacing only when cars pulled too close to the shoulder. The little girl from the gas station kept glancing toward them through the convenience store window while her father paid for fuel inside. When they finally drove away, she waved enthusiastically through the glass, and to Ethan's surprise, Scout sat up straighter and watched until the car disappeared down the highway. "You are getting popular," Ethan muttered with a tired smile. Once the engine cooled enough, he refilled the radiator with water from the old gallon jug and closed the hood carefully. He already knew the truck was not going to survive much longer. Every mile west felt borrowed. Still, sitting still scared him more than moving forward. Somewhere deep inside, he kept imagining that if he stayed in motion long enough, maybe eventually he would outrun the version of himself he had become. Around late afternoon, Ethan and Scout reached a small town near the New Mexico border where faded Christmas decorations already hung across Main Street despite Thanksgiving still being a week away. The town looked worn but alive in the stubborn way many desert towns survive, with old diners, auto shops, and family-owned stores refusing to disappear no matter how many highways rerouted around them. Ethan parked near a laundromat because he needed to wash the only 2 shirts left in his duffel bag. Scout climbed out beside him immediately, drawing attention from nearly everybody passing by. An older man smoking outside the laundromat nodded toward the dog. "Beautiful shepherd," he said. "Military?" Ethan shook his head. "No, sir. Just found him outside Flagstaff." The man studied Scout for a moment before replying quietly. "Funny thing about dogs like that. They usually find people, not the other way around." Ethan carried his clothes inside, while Scout waited near the door without needing a leash. A young mother folding towels smiled nervously at first when she saw the large dog, but Scout simply laid down calmly near the entrance, watching Ethan through the glass of the washing machines with steady, patient eyes. Ethan sat alone beside the dryers listening to the low mechanical hum filling the room, while warm air carried the smell of detergent around him. For the first time in months, maybe years, he noticed something strange. He no longer felt invisible. People nodded at him now. They smiled. They asked questions. Not because of him exactly, but because Scout somehow made strangers lower their guard. It was as though the dog carried an unspoken message that Ethan might still be worth talking to after all. While waiting for the laundry to finish, Ethan walked to a nearby grocery store and used the last of his cash to buy canned soup, bottled water, and a small bag of dog food with a German shepherd printed proudly across the front. Back at the truck, he poured some into an old plastic container he found beneath the seat. Scout ate slowly but happily while Ethan heated soup using a portable camping burner he had not touched in years. Evening settled over the town in soft orange light, while cold wind swept fallen leaves across the parking lot. Ethan leaned against the truck, eating quietly beside the dog, watching families move through the streets carrying shopping bags and laughing about ordinary things. It hurt in a way he could not fully explain because he realized how long it had been since he felt connected to simple moments like these. Scout eventually walked closer and rested against his side again. Ethan stared down at the dog for a long moment before speaking softly into the fading light. "You know what the worst part is?" he asked. "I think I stopped believing anybody would ever need me again." Scout lifted his head slightly at the sound of Ethan's voice, and somewhere deep beneath years of disappointment and silence, something inside Ethan began to loosen just enough to let a little warmth back in. People rarely notice the exact moment their life begins changing because real change does not happen all at once. It happens through small choices that quietly pull a person back toward the world one step at a time. Ethan woke early the next morning inside the truck parked behind the laundromat, the windows fogged from cold air meeting their breath during the night. For a few seconds he forgot where he was, but then Scout lifted his head from the passenger seat and looked at him with calm, familiar eyes that somehow already felt like part of his routine. Ethan rubbed sleep from his face and noticed something surprising. The heavy pressure that normally sat on his chest every morning felt lighter. Not gone, but lighter enough that breathing did not feel like work anymore. Outside, the small town was beginning to wake beneath a gray winter sky. Store owners unlocked doors, delivery trucks rolled through quiet streets, and somewhere nearby church bells rang softly across the cold air. Ethan stepped out of the truck, stretching his stiff back, while Scout followed close beside him. They walked toward a diner near the corner where a hand-painted sign promised fresh coffee and homemade biscuits 24 hours a day. The warmth inside hit immediately, carrying smells of bacon grease, syrup, and old wooden floors cleaned thousands of times over the years. Several customers looked up when Scout entered beside Ethan, but the dog stayed perfectly calm near the booth while Ethan ordered breakfast. The waitress, a woman in her 60s with silver hair tied loosely behind her head, smiled warmly toward Scout before setting down a bowl of water without even being asked. "He has good manners," she said. Ethan glanced toward the dog resting quietly beside the table. "Better than mine most days," he answered softly. The waitress laughed gently, then looked at Ethan more carefully. "You passing through?" Ethan hesitated before nodding. "Something like that." She poured more coffee into his mug and lowered her voice slightly. "My husband drove trucks for 30 years. He always said the road can either help a man find himself again or help him disappear completely. Depends which direction he is running." Ethan stared down into the dark coffee for several seconds after she walked away because the words landed harder than he expected. He realized he had spent years convincing himself he was moving forward when really he had only been avoiding standing still long enough to face what he lost. After breakfast, Ethan stepped outside with Scout and noticed a help wanted sign hanging crookedly in the window of an auto repair shop across the street. He almost ignored it automatically. For years, rejection had trained him not to expect opportunities anymore. But Scout suddenly stopped walking and looked directly toward the garage entrance, ears raised as if waiting. Ethan let out a quiet breath through his nose. "You really are not going to let me keep hiding, are you?" he muttered. A few minutes later, he found himself standing awkwardly inside the repair shop speaking with the owner, a broad-shouldered man named Carl Bennett, whose grease-covered hands suggested he still worked alongside his employees every day. Ethan explained he used to run construction crews and knew enough about engines to handle basic repair work. Carl listened carefully while Scout sat patiently beside Ethan near the office desk. "Dog yours?" Carl asked finally. Ethan looked down at Scout before answering. "Feels like he is." Carl nodded slowly. Anybody trusted by a shepherd like that usually deserves a second look. The sentence caught Ethan off guard because he could not remember the last time somebody offered him trust before demanding proof. Carl eventually handed Ethan a work glove from the counter and pointed toward an old pickup parked near the garage bay. "Truck needs a fuel pump and winter is coming fast. You willing to work?" Ethan stared at the glove in his hand for a second longer than necessary, while something unfamiliar slowly returned inside him. Purpose. Real purpose. He swallowed hard and nodded once. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I think I am." There comes a point in every broken life when a person must decide whether they still believe they deserve another chance. And for Ethan, that moment arrived holding a grease-covered wrench beneath the dim lights of a small repair garage in New Mexico. The work felt awkward at first because his hands had spent too many years carrying exhaustion instead of purpose, but muscle memory slowly returned as the morning passed. Ethan replaced hoses, checked fluid lines, and helped Carl remove the damaged fuel pump from the old pickup sitting inside the garage bay, while country music played softly through a dusty radio near the office window. Scout stayed nearby the entire time, lying beside Ethan's toolbox with calm, watchful eyes that followed every movement inside the shop. The other mechanics warmed up to the dog almost immediately. A younger employee named Louise tossed Scout pieces of beef jerky during lunch break, while another worker scratched behind the shepherd's ears and joked that the dog already looked more responsible than half the employees he had hired over the years. Ethan found himself smiling more than once without forcing it. That realization alone felt strange enough to almost scare him. Around mid-afternoon, Carl handed Ethan an envelope with cash for the day's work. Ethan stared at it for a second before speaking quietly. "You did not have to pay me this soon." Carl shrugged, while wiping oil from his hands. Man works, man gets paid. Pretty simple system around here. Ethan nodded slowly, unable to explain why such ordinary fairness felt almost unfamiliar now. After years of feeling like a burden everywhere he went, being treated with simple respect again hit harder than pity ever could. Later that evening, Ethan parked his truck behind the garage, where Carl allowed him to stay temporarily until he figured things out. The winter air carried the smell of snow somewhere far off beyond the desert hills, and strings of Christmas lights hanging across Main Street flickered softly against the darkening sky. Scout sat beside Ethan near the open tailgate while he ate takeout chili from a paper container. "Well, buddy," Ethan said quietly, "looks like we survived another day." Scout leaned lightly against his leg again, his steady presence beginning to feel less like coincidence and more like something meant to happen. Ethan looked up at the stars slowly appearing overhead and realized he had not felt this calm in years. Not happy exactly. Happiness still felt too distant to trust. But calmer, less lost. That night, while organizing old tools inside the truck bed, Ethan found a small, unopened notebook buried beneath blankets and extension cords. Tyler had given it to him years earlier for Father's Day back, when everything still felt reparable. The first page contained messy teenage handwriting that immediately tightened Ethan's throat. "For all your road trip stories," it read. Ethan sat motionless for several seconds while cold wind swept through the empty alley behind the garage. He had never written in it once. Somewhere along the way, he stopped believing his life was worth remembering. Scout quietly rested his head beside Ethan's knee while Ethan stared down at the notebook beneath the glow of the truck's interior light. Finally, he grabbed a pen from the dashboard and opened to the second page. His hand hesitated before slowly writing the first sentence. "Met a German shepherd outside Flagstaff when I thought my life was over." Ethan stared at the words for a long moment after finishing them. They looked simple, almost meaningless, yet something about seeing them written down made the past few days suddenly feel real in a way his mind had not fully accepted yet. He closed the notebook carefully and leaned back against the truck. Across town, church bells rang softly through the cold evening air, while distant laughter drifted from nearby restaurants filled with families and friends. Ethan listened quietly, then reached down to scratch Scout gently behind the ears. "You know something?" he whispered. "I think you found me before I disappeared completely." Scout lifted his eyes toward him calmly, and for the first time in years, Ethan no longer felt like a man waiting for life to end. He felt like somebody slowly finding his way back into it. Sometimes healing begins the moment a person stops looking at themselves through the eyes of their failures and starts seeing themselves through the eyes of something that never gave up on them. Over the next several days, Ethan settled into a rhythm he had not experienced in years. He woke before sunrise in the back lot behind Carl's garage, shared breakfast with Scout from the diner across the street, then spent long hours working beneath the hum of fluorescent lights and the smell of oil and cold metal. The work exhausted him physically, but it was the kind of exhaustion that allowed a man to sleep peacefully afterward instead of lying awake replaying regrets in the dark. Scout became a familiar sight around town almost immediately. Children waved at him from passing cars. Store owners kept dog treats near their counters. Even customers arriving at the garage would smile the moment the German shepherd calmly walked over to greet them. Ethan noticed how differently people treated him now that Scout stood beside him. They asked about his day. They remembered his name. It made him realize how long he had gone without feeling connected to ordinary human kindness. One snowy afternoon near the end of November, Ethan sat inside the diner during lunch break while thick gray clouds gathered over the town outside. Scout rested beneath the booth beside him as waitresses moved through the crowded room carrying coffee pots and steaming plates of food. Christmas music played softly overhead while families laughed around nearby tables. Ethan stared quietly out the window watching snow begin to drift across Main Street when the waitress named Donna slid into the booth across from him, holding a fresh cup of coffee. "You have people somewhere waiting for you?" she asked gently. Ethan looked down at his hands for several seconds before answering. "I used to." Donna studied him carefully with the calm understanding of someone who had spent decades listening to lonely travelers. "That is not always the same thing as never having them again," she replied softly before standing to return to work. Ethan sat motionless after she walked away because the words stirred something painful he had spent years burying. That night, back behind the garage, he pulled the old photograph of Tyler from his wallet again. Snowflakes drifted quietly beneath the streetlights while Scout rested beside the truck wrapped partly in the blanket Ethan bought from a thrift store 2 days earlier. Tyler looked so young in the picture, smiling beside the lake in Colorado with sunlight across his face, and absolutely no idea how complicated life would eventually become. Ethan realized with sudden painful clarity that his son was probably nearly 30 years old now. A grown man, maybe married, maybe a father himself. Ethan closed his eyes briefly as guilt settled heavily across his chest. Years had passed because he stopped believing he deserved to return after failing everybody who depended on him. It had always felt easier to disappear than risk hearing disappointment again. Scout slowly moved closer until his shoulder rested against Ethan's leg. Ethan looked down at the dog and laughed weakly under his breath. "You really do not quit, do you?" Scout simply stared back with the same steady, loyal eyes that never seemed interested in who Ethan used to be, only who he still could become. Ethan reached into the truck and pulled out Tyler's notebook again. For nearly an hour, he wrote quietly beneath the falling snow, filling pages with memories he had avoided for years. Fishing trips, baseball games, campfires in the Rockies. Small moments that once felt ordinary but now seemed priceless. Eventually, the pen stopped moving as a thought settled inside him stronger than fear for the first time in years. Maybe disappearing had protected him from rejection, but it had also stolen every chance to reconnect with the people he loved. Ethan stared out across the snow-covered street while Christmas lights glowed softly through the darkness, and somewhere deep inside, a possibility he thought had died long ago slowly began to return. Maybe it was not too late to go home. The hardest roads in life are not the ones stretching across deserts or mountains. They are the ones leading back toward the people we are afraid we already lost forever. Ethan spent the next few days carrying the thought of Tyler everywhere he went. It followed him through the garage while he changed brake pads and repaired engines, lingered beside him at the diner over morning coffee, and sat quietly beside him at night beneath the snow-covered sky while Scout rested nearby. For years, Ethan convinced himself silence was easier for everyone involved, but now that excuse no longer felt true. The truth was far more painful. He had been afraid. Afraid Tyler moved on completely. Afraid hearing disappointment in his son's voice would finally confirm everything Ethan already believed about himself. One evening after closing the garage, Carl found Ethan sitting alone on the tailgate staring at the old photograph again while Scout slept beside the truck tire. "You keep looking at that picture like it owes you answers," Carl said gently as he walked over carrying 2 cups of coffee. Ethan accepted one with a quiet nod. For several moments, neither man spoke while snow drifted slowly through the yellow glow of the alley lights. Finally, Ethan sighed heavily. "My son probably hates me," he admitted. Carl leaned against the truck beside him and stared out toward the empty street. "Maybe," he answered honestly. "But hate is not the same thing as not caring." Ethan looked down at the steaming coffee in his hands. "I missed years, Carl. Then stop missing more." The simple sentence hit Ethan harder than anything he had heard in a long time, because deep down he knew Carl was right. Pain did not disappear just because a man avoided looking at it. Around midnight, Ethan climbed into the truck and turned on his nearly dead phone again. The screen glowed weakly in the darkness while Scout lifted his head from the passenger seat, watching quietly. Ethan stared at Tyler's old contact information for nearly a full minute before finally pressing call. The line rang twice before a robotic voice announced the number was no longer in service. Ethan lowered the phone slowly, disappointment washing through him sharper than expected, even though part of him anticipated it. He rubbed his hand over his tired face while Scout rested his chin gently against Ethan's arm. "Yeah," Ethan whispered softly. "I know. I waited too long. But something surprising happened after the sadness passed." He did not feel defeated. Not completely. For the first time in years, he actually wanted to keep trying instead of disappearing again. The next morning, Ethan asked Donna at the diner if she knew how to use social media better than he did. Donna laughed warmly and spent half an hour helping him search online for Tyler Walker, while Scout slept beneath the counter collecting attention from nearly every customer who entered. Ethan's hands trembled slightly the moment a profile picture finally appeared on the screen. Tyler looked older now, broader in the shoulders with faint lines beginning around his eyes, but Ethan recognized him instantly. The photo showed Tyler standing beside a woman and a little girl wearing a Denver Broncos jacket almost too big for her. Ethan stared at the image so long his vision blurred slightly. "That your family?" Donna asked softly. Ethan nodded once, unable to speak immediately. "A granddaughter." Somewhere in Colorado, there was a little girl carrying part of his blood who probably did not even know he existed. The realization cracked something open inside him all over again. Donna gently touched his shoulder before walking away to give him privacy. Ethan sat motionless while Scout quietly rested beside his boots. Finally, Ethan opened the message box with shaking hands. He typed 3 different versions before deleting each one. Nothing sounded right after years of silence. At last, he simply wrote the truth. "Hi, Tyler. I know I probably do not deserve an answer, but I have thought about you every day." Ethan stared at the message for several long seconds while fear tightened his chest. Then, before he could lose courage again, he pressed send. Waiting for forgiveness can feel heavier than carrying regret, because at least regret becomes familiar after enough years. But hope has a way of making people vulnerable all over again. Ethan barely slept the night after sending the message to Tyler. Every vibration from his phone made his heart jump before disappointment settled back in when the screen stayed dark. By morning, he convinced himself the message had probably been ignored, maybe even blocked. Immediately, and part of him believed he deserved exactly that. Still, he noticed something important while drinking coffee outside the garage before sunrise with Scout resting beside his boots. For the first time in years, he had stopped running. Whether Tyler answered or not, Ethan finally reached back toward the people he loved instead of disappearing into silence again. Snow covered the sidewalks lightly that morning while the town moved slowly beneath heavy gray skies. Carl tossed Ethan a set of keys inside the garage and pointed toward an old Ford truck needing repairs before winter storms arrived. Ethan buried himself in work, grateful for something physical to focus on besides the ache in his chest. Scout wandered calmly between the office and garage bays throughout the day, collecting attention from customers and quietly following Ethan everywhere else. Around lunchtime, Ethan heard his phone buzz from inside his jacket pocket while he was tightening bolts beneath the truck hood. His hands froze instantly. For a second, he could not breathe. He pulled the phone out slowly, staring at the screen while fear and hope crashed together inside him hard enough to make his chest hurt. One new message. "Tyler Walker." Ethan stepped away from the garage noise before opening it. The message was short. "I did not know if I would ever hear from you again." Ethan read the sentence 3 times while emotion tightened his throat unexpectedly. Scout appeared beside him almost immediately, as if sensing something had changed. Ethan leaned back against the cold brick wall outside the garage while snowflakes drifted quietly around them. His fingers trembled slightly as he typed a reply. "I am sorry it took this long." Minutes passed before another message appeared. "I used to wait for your calls when I was younger." Ethan closed his eyes briefly as guilt hit him harder than ever before. He remembered birthdays missed, school events forgotten, holidays spent alone because shame convinced him absence hurt less than failure. Yet Tyler had waited anyway. That realization nearly broke him. Ethan swallowed hard and wrote carefully. "You had every reason to stop believing in me." The typing bubble appeared almost immediately this time. "Maybe, but I never stopped wondering where you were." Ethan stared at the words while tears blurred his vision enough that he had to look away toward the snowy street. He felt Scout pressed gently against his side, steady and silent beneath the cold afternoon sky. People passed by carrying shopping bags and winter coats, unaware that a man standing beside a repair garage was slowly getting pieces of his life back one message at a time. Tyler eventually sent another photo. It showed a little girl around 6 years old sitting beside a Christmas tree holding a stuffed reindeer almost as large as she was. She had Tyler's eyes. Ethan smiled through tears before he even realized he was crying. "Her name is Emma," Tyler wrote. "She loves dogs." Ethan looked down at Scout beside him and laughed softly under his breath. "You hear that, buddy?" he whispered. "Looks like you might finally have competition." For the next hour, father and son exchanged careful messages filled with awkward pauses, old memories, and years of unspoken hurt trying slowly to find their place again. Nothing felt magically repaired. Pain still existed between every sentence. But beneath it all was something stronger than Ethan expected. Willingness. Tyler was still answering. Still listening. Still there. As evening settled over the town, Ethan sat alone in the truck reading through the conversation again while Christmas lights reflected softly across the windshield. Scout rested quietly beside him with his head against Ethan's arm. Ethan stared at the latest message from Tyler for a long moment before reading it aloud into the silence. "Maybe you could come to Denver for Christmas if you want." Ethan lowered the phone slowly while emotion filled the small cab so completely he could barely speak. After all the years he spent believing he had already lost everything worth returning to, somebody had finally opened a door back home. Sometimes the most emotional journeys do not begin with crossing thousands of miles. They begin with believing you are worthy of arriving somewhere again. After Tyler invited him to Denver for Christmas, Ethan spent 2 full days staring at the message whenever he had a quiet moment alone. Part of him still struggled to trust it was real. He kept expecting the invitation to disappear or another message to arrive saying Tyler changed his mind. But it never happened. Instead, their conversations slowly became longer. Careful at first, awkward in places, but honest. Tyler told Ethan about working as a physical therapist outside Denver, about meeting his wife Rachel in college, about Emma becoming obsessed with drawing dogs after seeing police K-9 demonstrations at school. Ethan shared stories about the road, the repair shop, and eventually about Scout. Tyler seemed especially interested in that part. "Sounds like the dog saved you," he wrote one night. Ethan looked over at Scout sleeping beside the truck heater while snow tapped softly against the windshield. After a long pause, he typed back the truth. "I think he reminded me I was still worth finding." A few days before Christmas, Carl walked into the garage office carrying a folded envelope and tossed it onto Ethan's toolbox. "Bonus," he said simply. Ethan immediately shook his head. "Carl, I have only been here a few weeks." "Exactly," Carl replied. "And you worked harder than half the men I have known 20 years. Ethan opened the envelope and stared quietly at the cash inside. Enough for gas, food, and maybe even a motel room during the drive north. He looked up slowly. "You really do not have to keep helping me like this." Carl shrugged while pulling on his coat. "Maybe somebody should have helped you sooner." Ethan could not answer immediately because gratitude sat too heavily in his chest. That evening, the entire town seemed wrapped in Christmas lights and fresh snow. Storefront windows glowed warmly against the cold, dark streets, while music drifted from restaurants crowded with families escaping the winter air. Ethan stood beside the truck checking tire pressure before the long drive to Colorado, while Scout watched from nearby. For the first time in years, Ethan felt nervous about the future in a good way. Not fear of surviving. Fear of hoping too much. Donna from the diner walked across the street carrying a small paper bag and handed it to Ethan with a smile. Inside was a thick knitted scarf and homemade peanut butter cookies. "Nobody drives through Colorado in December without winter gear," she said firmly. Ethan laughed softly while emotion tightened his throat again. "I do not know how to thank all of you." Donna looked toward Scout sitting proudly beside the truck. "Looks to me like that dog already handled introductions." Late that night, Ethan sat alone inside the cab with the engine running softly while snow fell beneath the yellow alley lights around them. Scout rested his head near the center console as Ethan scrolled through photos Tyler had sent throughout the week. Emma building snowmen. Rachel decorating cookies. Tyler standing outside their house hanging Christmas lights while bundled in a Broncos jacket. Simple, ordinary moments Ethan once believed were gone forever. He stopped on one particular picture showing Emma holding a handwritten sign that read, "Can Scout come too?" Ethan laughed quietly through wet eyes and rubbed a hand over his face. "Guess you already got invited before me," he whispered toward the dog. Scout opened one eye lazily before resting again against the seat. Ethan stared through the windshield at the softly falling snow while memories from years ago drifted back into focus. Family road trips. Christmas mornings. Tyler running downstairs before sunrise, too excited to sleep. For a long time, those memories only caused pain because they reminded Ethan of everything he lost. But now, for the first time, they felt different. They no longer looked like doors permanently closed behind him. They looked like roads leading somewhere ahead. Ethan reached down and scratched behind Scout's ears gently. "Tomorrow we head to Denver," he said softly. "And buddy, I am terrified." Scout lifted his head and looked at him calmly with that same steady trust he carried from the very first night beside the gas station in Arizona. Somehow the dog seemed completely certain about something Ethan was only beginning to believe himself. Sometimes people really can find their way home again. The strange thing about returning home after years away is that the closer you get, the more every mile feels tied to who you used to be and who you still hope to become. Ethan left New Mexico before sunrise the next morning with snow swirling lightly across the highway and Scout sitting alert in the passenger seat, like he understood the importance of the journey ahead. The truck still rattled louder than it should have, but Carl spent half the previous evening helping replace worn belts and checking the engine one last time before they left town. As Ethan drove north through frozen desert roads and distant mountain ranges dusted white with winter snow, he found himself gripping the steering wheel tighter every hour. Fear returned in waves during the drive. What if seeing him in person reopened old wounds for Tyler instead of healing them? What if Emma felt uncomfortable around a grandfather she had never met? What if Ethan walked into that house carrying too much regret to fit inside a normal family Christmas? Scout occasionally rested his head against Ethan's arm whenever silence grew too heavy, and somehow that simple gesture kept Ethan moving forward. By late afternoon, the Rocky Mountains finally appeared along the horizon beneath pale winter sunlight, and something inside Ethan shifted the moment he saw them again. Colorado still looked exactly the way he remembered. Snow-covered pines stretching across hillsides, thin smoke rising from distant cabins, frozen lakes reflecting silver beneath the sky. Memories hit him so strongly he had to blink several times just to stay focused on the road. Tyler used to love these mountains. As a child, he always rolled down the truck windows no matter how cold it was, because he liked the smell of pine trees and snow. Ethan smiled faintly at the memory while emotion tightened inside his chest again. Around sunset, his phone buzzed with a new message. Emma keeps asking every 15 minutes if Scout is close yet. Ethan laughed softly for the first time in hours. He typed back carefully with freezing fingers while stopped at a red light outside Denver. Tell her Scout is very excited about meeting the person who stole his job as favorite family member. Tyler responded almost immediately with a laughing emoji and directions to the house. Ethan stared at the address for several seconds afterward. A real address. A real invitation. After years spent drifting between motels, highways, and empty parking lots, somebody was actually waiting for him somewhere. Darkness settled fully over Denver by the time Ethan finally pulled into the neighborhood. Christmas lights glowed across nearly every house, while fresh snow covered rooftops and sidewalks beneath the street lamps. Ethan slowed the truck near Tyler's street as nervousness hit him so hard he almost kept driving. His hands trembled lightly on the steering wheel. Scout sat up straighter beside him, watching quietly. I do not know if I can do this, Ethan whispered honestly. Scout looked at him with steady, calm eyes before placing one paw gently against Ethan's leg. Ethan let out a shaky breath and laughed weakly. Yeah, he murmured. You already decided for both of us. A few moments later, the truck rolled slowly to a stop outside a two-story house, glowing warmly against the winter night. Colored Christmas lights hung across the porch railings while soft golden light spilled through the windows onto the snow. Ethan sat frozen behind the wheel staring at the house, because for years he dreamed about moments like this while also convincing himself they could never happen anymore. Then the front door suddenly opened. A little girl wearing pink winter boots burst onto the porch, so quickly a woman behind her had to grab the back of her coat before she slipped on the snow. Ethan recognized Tyler immediately standing just behind them beneath the porch light. Older now, taller somehow, broader in the shoulders, but still unmistakably his son. Scout gave a low, excited sound and pressed toward the passenger door while Emma jumped up and down, pointing wildly toward the truck. Ethan's vision blurred instantly as emotion crashed through him harder than he expected. After all the empty highways and lonely nights, after all the years spent believing he disappeared from the world completely, somebody was finally happy to see him arrive. The beautiful thing about being found again is that life rarely asks a person to become perfect before offering them another chance to belong. Ethan sat motionless behind the wheel for several seconds after the front door opened, overwhelmed by the sight of Tyler standing there in the falling snow. Time had changed them both in different ways, but in that moment Ethan suddenly saw flashes of the little boy who used to fall asleep during fishing trips with his baseball cap tilted sideways across his face. Scout barked softly beside him, tail hitting the passenger seat impatiently, and the sound finally pulled Ethan back into the present. He stepped out of the truck slowly while cold Colorado air rushed around him, carrying the smell of snow and chimney smoke. Emma immediately pointed toward Scout with wide, excited eyes. "He is even bigger than the pictures," she shouted happily while Rachel laughed behind her. Tyler stood quietly near the porch steps at first, hands buried inside his coat pockets, as though neither of them fully knew how to begin after so many lost years. Ethan felt emotion closing around his throat again, while snowflakes settled across his jacket and hair. "Hey, kid," he said softly before realizing how strange that sounded now that Tyler was a grown man with a family of his own. Tyler laughed quietly under his breath, and that small familiar sound broke something open between them instantly. A second later, Tyler stepped forward and wrapped his arms around his father for the first time in more than a decade. Ethan closed his eyes tightly as emotion hit him all at once. The years apart, the mistakes, the regret, the loneliness. It all seemed to collapse beneath the simple reality that his son was still holding on to him instead of walking away. Neither man spoke for several long seconds while snow drifted silently around the driveway. Finally, Tyler pulled back slightly and nodded toward the porch. "You better come inside before Emma steals your dog permanently." Ethan laughed through wet eyes while Scout happily trotted toward the house beside the little girl, already talking nonstop about dog toys and Christmas cookies. The warmth inside the house wrapped around Ethan the moment he stepped through the door. Lights from the Christmas tree filled the living room softly while the smell of cinnamon and fresh coffee drifted through the air. Family photographs lined the walls. Children's drawings covered part of the refrigerator. Ordinary, beautiful life surrounded him everywhere he looked. For years, Ethan convinced himself he no longer belonged in places like this, but Rachel welcomed him with calm kindness that immediately eased part of his fear. Emma sat cross-legged on the carpet beside Scout within minutes, proudly showing him stuffed animals, while the German Shepherd accepted every bit of attention like he had lived there forever. At one point, Emma looked up toward Ethan and smiled brightly. "Scout likes you a lot," she announced. Ethan glanced toward the dog lying peacefully beside the Christmas tree before answering quietly, "Yeah, he found me when I really needed somebody." Later that evening, Ethan stood alone for a moment near the kitchen window, holding a mug of coffee while snow continued falling softly outside. Behind him, he could hear Tyler laughing with Rachel while Emma tried teaching Scout how to wear a paper Christmas bow around his neck. The sounds filled the house with warmth Ethan thought he had lost forever. Tyler eventually walked over beside him and handed him an old photograph Ethan had not seen in years. It showed the two of them standing beside a lake in Colorado holding fishing poles beneath a bright summer sky. "I kept this all these years," Tyler said quietly. Ethan stared at the picture while emotion rose inside him once more. "I do not deserve how patient you have been with me," he admitted softly. Tyler looked toward Emma laughing with Scout near the tree before answering. "Maybe not, but people can still come home anyway." Ethan nodded slowly while tears blurred his vision again. Outside, snow covered the world in silence, but inside that house something broken had finally begun healing. Ethan looked toward Scout resting peacefully beside his granddaughter and understood something clearly for the first time in years. The dog did not just save him from loneliness on a cold night beside a highway in Arizona. Scout led him back to the people waiting for him. All along.